Hello, everyone, and welcome back for a early installment today of Good Omens. This is basically the only time of the day that I can get this in today. It's a busy one for me today. But we're going to go ahead and proceed with the next part of Chapter 6, which is going to keep us going with the threads that we've been picking up previously. We're going to have more with Newt and Anathema, who have come together after Newt's car crashed basically in the vicinity of Jasmine Cottage. We're going to have more with Adam and the Them, who are currently still discussing the things that Adam has read in the magazines that were given to him by Anathema, which is causing the world to change around them. And we're going to have a bit of an update on what's going on with the rest of the world as it is beginning to end. So, without further ado, let's go ahead and we'll hop right into it. Most psychic abilities are caused by a simple lack of temporal focus, and the mind of Agnes Nutter was so far adrift in time that she was considered pretty mad even by the standards of 17th century Lancashire, where mad prophetesses were a growth industry. But she was a treat to listen to, everyone agreed. She used to go on about curing illnesses by using a sort of mold, and the importance of washing your hands so that the tiny little animals who caused diseases would be washed away, when every sensible person knew that a good stink was the only defense against the demons of ill health. She advocated running at a sort of gentle, bouncing trot as an aid to living longer, which was extremely suspicious and first put the witch-finders onto her, and stressed the importance of fiber in diet. Although here, she was clearly ahead of her time, since most people were less bothered about the fiber in their diet than the gravel. And she wouldn't cure warts. "It is all in your mind," she'd say. "Forget about it, and it will go away." It was obvious that Agnes had a line to the future, but it was an unusually narrow and specific line. In other words, almost totally useless. "How do you mean?" said Newt. "She managed to come up with the kind of predictions that you can only understand after the thing has happened," said Anathema. "Like, do not buy Betamax. That was a prediction for 1972. "You mean she predicted videotape recorders?" "No, she just picked up one little fragment of information," said Anathema. "That's the point. Most of the time she comes up with such an oblique reference that you can't work it out until it's gone past, and then it all slots into place. And she didn't know what was going to be important or not, so it's all a bit hit and miss. Her prediction for November 22nd, 1963 was about a house falling down in King's Lynn." "Oh?" Newt looked politely blank. "President Kennedy was assassinated," said Anathema helpfully. "But Dallas didn't exist then, you see, whereas King's Lynn was quite important." "Oh." "She was generally very good if her descendants were involved." "Oh." "And she wouldn't know anything about the internal combustion engine. To her, they were just funny chariots. Even my mother thought it referred to an emperor's carriage overturning. You see, it's not enough to know what the future is. You have to know what it means. Agnes was like someone looking at a huge picture down a tiny little tube. She wrote down what seemed like good advice based on what she understood of the tiny little glimpses. Sometimes you can be lucky," Anathema went on. "My great-grandfather worked out about the stock market crash of 1929, for example, 2 days before it actually happened. Made a fortune. You could say we're professional descendants." She looked sharply at Newt. "You see, what no one ever realized until about 200 years ago is that the nice and accurate prophecies was Agnes's idea of a family heirloom. Many of the prophecies relate to her descendants and their well-being. She was sort of trying to look after us after she'd gone. That's the reason for the King's Lynn prophecy, we think. My father was visiting there at the time, so from Agnes's point of view, while he was unlikely to be struck by stray rounds from Dallas, there was a good chance he might be hit by a brick." "What a nice person," said Newt. "You could almost overlook her blowing up an entire village." Anathema ignored this. "Anyway, that's about it," she said. "Ever since then, we've made it our job to interpret them. After all, it averages out to about one prophecy a month. And more now, in fact, as we get closer to the end of the world." "And when is that going to be?" said Newt. Anathema looked meaningfully at the clock. He gave a horrible little laugh that he hoped sounded suave and worldly. After the events so far today, he wasn't feeling very sane. And he could smell Anathema's perfume, which made him uncomfortable. "Think yourself lucky I don't need a stopwatch," said Anathema. "We've got, about 5 or 6 hours." Newt turned this over in his mind. Thus far in his life, he'd never had the urge to drink alcohol, but something told him there had to be a first time. "Do witches keep drink in the house?" he ventured. "Oh, yes." She smiled the sort of smile Agnes Nutter might have smiled when unpacking the contents of her lingerie drawer. "Green bubbly stuff with strange things squirming on the congealing surface. You should know that." "Fine. Got any ice?" It turned out to be gin. There was ice. Anathema, who had picked up witchcraft as she went along, disapproved of liquor in general, but approved of it in her specific case. "Did I tell you about the Tibetan coming out of a hole in the road?" Newt said, relaxing a bit. "Oh, I know about them," she said, shuffling the papers on the table. "The two of them came out of the front lawn yesterday. The poor things were quite bewildered, so I gave them a cup of tea, and then they borrowed a spade and went down again. I don't think they quite know what they're supposed to be doing." Newt felt slightly aggrieved. "How did you know they were Tibetan?" he said. "If it comes to that, how did you know? Did he go Om when you hit him?" "Well, he looked Tibetan," said Newt. "Saffron robes, bald head. You know, Tibetan." "One of mine spoke quite good English. It seems that one minute he was repairing radios in Lhasa, next minute he was in a tunnel. He doesn't know how he's going to get home." "If you'd sent him up the road, he probably could have got a lift on a flying saucer," said Newt gloomily. "3 aliens? One of them a little tin robot?" "They landed on your lawn too, did they?" "It's about the only place they didn't land, according to the radio. They keep coming down all over the world, delivering a short, trite message of cosmic peace, and when people say, yes, well, they give them a blank look and take off again. Signs and portents, just like Agnes said." "You're going to tell me she predicted all this too, I suppose?" Agnes leafed through a battered card index in front of her. "I keep meaning to put it all on computer," she said. "Word searches and so forth, you know? It'd make it a lot simpler. The prophecies are arranged in any old order, but there are clues, handwriting, and so—" "She did it all in a card index," said Newt. "No, a book, but I've, mislaid it. We've always had copies, of course." "Lost it, eh?" said Newt, trying to inject some humor into the proceedings. "Bet she didn't foresee that." Anathema glowered at him. If looks could kill, Newt would have been on a slab. Then she went on. "We've built up quite a concordance over the years, though, and my grandfather came up with a useful cross-referencing system. Here we are." She pushed a sheet of paper in front of Newt. 3988. "When men of Crocus come from the earth, and green man come from the sky, yet ken not why, and Pluto's bars quit the lightning castles, and sunken lands riseth, and Leviathan runneth free, and Brazil is vert, then 3 cometh together, and 4 arise, upon iron horses ride. I tell you the end draweth nigh." Crocus equals saffron, cf. 2003. Aliens? Paratroops? Nuclear power stations? See cuttings no 798806. Atlantis, cuttings 812-819. Leviathan equals whale, cf. 1981. South America is green. 3 equals 4, railways, iron roads, cf. 2675. "I didn't get all of this one in advance," Anathema admitted. "I filled it in after listening to the news." "You must be incredibly good at crosswords in your family," said Newt. "I think Agnes is getting a bit out of her depth here, anyway. The bits about Leviathan and South America and 3s and 4s could mean anything." She sighed. "The problem is newspapers. You never know if Agnes is referring to some tiny little incident that you might miss. Do you know how long it takes to go through every daily paper thoroughly every morning?" 3 hours and 10 minutes, said Newt automatically. "I expect we'll get a medal or something," said Adam optimistically. "Rescuing a man from a blazing wreck." "It wasn't blazing," said Pepper. "It wasn't even very wrecked when we put it back right side up." "It could have been," Adam pointed out. "I don't see why we shouldn't have a medal just because some old car doesn't know when to catch fire." They stood looking down at the hole. Anathema had called the police, who had put it down to subsidence and put some cones around it. It was dark and went down a long way. "Could be good fun going to Tibet," said Brian. "We could learn martial arts and stuff. I saw this old film where there's this valley in Tibet and everyone lives there for hundreds of years. It's called Shangri-La." "My aunt's bungalow's called Shangri-La," said Wensleydale. Adam snorted. "Not very clever, naming a valley after some old bungalow," he said. "Might as well call it Dunroman or the Laurels." "It's not better than Shambles, anyway," said Wensleydale mildly. "Shambhala," corrected Adam. I expect it's the same place. Probably got both names, said Pepper with unusual diplomacy. Like our house. We changed the name from the Lodge to Norton View when we moved in, but we still get letters addressed to Theo C. Coupier, the Lodge. Perhaps they've named it Shambhala now, but people still call it the Laurels. Adam flicked a pebble into the hole. He was becoming bored with Tibetans. What shall we do now? Said Pepper. They're dipping sheep over at Norton Bottom Farm. We could go and help. Adam threw a larger stone into the hole and waited for the thump. It didn't come. Dunno, he said distantly. I reckon we should do something about whales and forests and such like. Like what? Said Brian, who enjoyed the diversions available at a good sheep dipping. He began to empty his pockets of crisp packets and drop them one by one into the hole. We could go into Tadfield this afternoon and not have a hamburger, said Pepper. If all four of us don't have one, that's millions of acres of rainforest they won't have to cut down. They'll be cutting them down anyway, said Wensleydale. It's grass materialism again, said Adam. Same with the whales. It's amazing the stuff that goes on. He stared at Dog. He was feeling very odd. The little mongrel, noticing the attention, balanced expectantly on his hind legs. It's people like you that's eaten all the whales, said Adam severely. I bet you've used up nearly a whole whale already. Dog, one last tiny satanic spark of his soul hating himself for it, put his head on one side and whined. This is going to be a fine old world to grow up in, Adam said. No whales, no air, and everyone paddling around because the sea's rising. Then the Atlanteans will be the only ones well off, said Pepper cheerfully. Said Adam, not really listening. Something was happening inside his head. It was aching. Thoughts were arriving there without him having to think them. Something was saying, you can do something, Adam Young. You can make it all better. You can do anything you want. And what was saying this to him was him. Part of him, deep down. Part of him that had been attached to him all these years and not really noticed. Like a shadow. It was saying, yes, it's a rotten world. It could have been great, but now it's rotten and it's time to do something about it. That's what you're here for. To make it all better. Because they'd be able to go everywhere, Pepper went on, giving him a worried look. The Atlanteans, I mean, because... I'm fed up with the old Atlanteans and Tibetans, snapped Adam. They stared at him. They'd never seen him like this before. It's all very well for them, said Adam. Everyone's going around using up all the whales and coal and oil and ozone and rainforests and that, and there'll be none left for us. We should be going to Mars and stuff instead of sitting around in the dark and wet with the air spilling away. This wasn't the old Adam the them knew. The them avoided one another's faces. With Adam in this mood, the world seemed a chillier place. Seems to me, said Brian pragmatically, seems to me the best thing you could do about it is to stop reading about it. It's like you said the other day, said Adam. You grow up reading about pirates and cowboys and spacemen and stuff, and just when you think the world's all full of amazing things, they tell you it's really all dead whales and chopped down forests and nuclear waste hanging about for millions of years. It's not worth growing up for, if you ask my opinion. The them exchanged glances. There was a shadow over the whole world. Storm clouds were building up in the north, the sunlight glowing yellow off them as though the sky had been painted by an enthusiastic amateur. Seems to me it ought to be rolled up and started all over again, said Adam. That hadn't sounded like Adam's voice. A bitter wind blew through the summer woods. Adam looked at Dog, who tried to stand on his head. There was a distant mutter of thunder. He reached down and patted the dog absent-mindedly. Serve everyone right if all the nuclear bombs went off and all started again, only properly organized, said Adam. Sometimes I think that's what I'd like to happen, and then we could sort everything out. The thunder growled again. Pepper shivered. This wasn't the normal them Mobius bickering, which passed many a slow hour. There was a look in Adam's eye that his friend couldn't quite fathom. Not devilment, because that was more or less all the time, but a sort of blank grayness that was far worse. Well, I don't know about we, Pepper tried. Don't know about the we, because if there's all these bombs going off, we all get blown up. Speaking as a mother of unborn generations, I'm against it. They looked at her curiously. She shrugged. And then giant ants take over the world, said Wensleydale nervously. I saw this film. Or you go around with sawn-off shotguns and everyone's got these cars with, knives and guns stuck on. I wouldn't allow any giant ants or anything like that, said Adam, brightening up horribly. And you'd have to all be all right, I'd see to that. It'd be wicked, to have the world to ourselves, wouldn't it? We could share it out. We could have amazing games. We could have war with real armies and stuff. But there wouldn't be any people, said Pepper. Oh, I could make us some people, said Adam airily. Good enough for armies, at any rate. We could all have a quarter of the world each. Like you, he pointed to Pepper, who recoiled as though Adam's finger were a white-hot poker. Could have Russia, because it's red and you've got red hair, right? And Wensley can have America, and Brian can have Africa and Europe, and... Even in their state of mounting terror, the them gave this the consideration it deserved. Huh, stuttered Pepper as the rising wind whipped at her t-shirt. I don't see why Wensley's got America and all I've got is just Russia. Russia's boring. You can have China and India and Japan, said Adam. That means I've just got Africa and a lot of just boring little countries, said Brian, negotiating even on the curl of the catastrophe curve. I wouldn't mind Australia, he added. Pepper nudged him and shook her head urgently. Dog's gonna have Australia, said Adam, his eyes glowing with the fires of creation, on account of him needing a lot of space to run about. And there's all those rabbits and kangaroos for him to chase, and... The clouds spread forwards and sideways, like ink poured into a bowl of clear water, moving across the sky faster than the wind. But there won't be any Wensleydale shrieked. Adam wasn't listening, at least not to any voices outside his own head. It's all too much of a mess, he said. We should start again. Just save the ones we want and start again. That's the best way. It'd be doing the earth a favor when you come to think about it. Makes me angry seeing the way those old loonies are messing it up. It's memory, you see, said Anathema. It works backwards as well as forwards. Racial memory, I mean. Newt gave her a polite but blank look. What I'm trying to say, she said patiently, is that Agnes didn't see the future. That's just a metaphor. She remembered it. Not very well, of course, and by the time it had been filtered through her own understanding, it's often a bit confused. We think it's best at remembering things that were going to happen to her descendants. But if you're going to places and doing things because of what she wrote, and what she wrote is her recollection of the places you went to and the things you did, said Newt, then, I know, but there's some evidence that that's how it works, said Anathema. They looked at the map spread out between them. Beside them, the radio murmured. Newt was very aware that a woman was sitting next to him. Be professional, he told himself. You're a soldier, aren't you? Well, practically. Then act like a soldier. He thought hard for a fraction of a second. Well, act like a respectable soldier on his best behavior, then. He forced his attention back to the matter at hand. Why low at Tadfield? Said Newt. I just got interested because of the weather. Optimal microclimate, they call it. That means it's a small place with its own personal nice weather. He glanced at her notebooks. There was definitely something odd about the place, even if you ignored Tibetans and UFOs, which seemed to be infesting the whole world these days. The Tadfield area didn't only have the kind of weather you could set your calendar by, it was also remarkably resistant to change. No one seemed to build new houses there. The population didn't seem to move much. There seemed to be more woods and hedges than you'd normally expect these days. The only battery farm to open in the area had failed after a year or two, and been replaced by an old-fashioned pig farmer who let his pigs run loose in his apple orchards and sold the pork at premium prices. The two local schools seemed to soldier on in blissful immunity from the changing fashions of education. A motorway, which should have turned most of Lower Tadfield into little more than the Junction 18 Happy Porker rest area, changed course 5 miles away, detoured in a great semicircle, and continued on its way, oblivious to the little island of rural changelessness it had avoided. No one quite seemed to know why. One of the surveyors involved had a nervous breakdown, a second had become a monk, and a third had gone off to Bali to paint nude women. It was as if a large part of the 20th century had marked a few square miles out of bounds. Anathema pulled another card out of her index and flicked it across the table. 2315. Some say it cometh in London town or New York, but they be wrong, for the place is Tadfield. Strong in his power, he cometh like a knight in the fief. He divideth the world into 4 parts, he bringeth the storm. 4 years early, New Amsterdam till 1664. Tadville, Norfolk. Tadsfield, Devon. Tadfield, Oxon. See Revelation, C6, Volume 10. I had to go and look through a lot of country records, said Anathema. Why's this one 2315? It's earlier than the others. Agnes was a bit slapdash about timing. I don't think she always knew what went where. I told you, we've spent ages devising a sort of system for chaining them together. Newt looked at a few cards. For example, 1111. And the great hound shall come, and the 2 powers shall watch in vain, for it goeth where is its master. Where they wot not, and he shall name it, true to its nature, and hell shall flee it. Is this something to do with Bismarck? AF device, June 8th, 1888. Schleswig-Holstein? She's being unusually obtuse for Agnes, said Anathema. 3017. I see 4 riding, bringing the end, and the angels of hell ride with them. And 3 shall rise, and 4 and 4 together be 4, and the dark angel shall own defeat, yet the man shall claim his own. The Apocalyptic Horseman. The man equals Pan, the devil. The Witch Trials of Lancashire, Brewster, 1782. I feel good Agnes had drunk well this night. Quincy device, October 15th, 1789. I concur. We are all human, alas. Miss O.J. device, January 5th, 1854. Why nice and accurate? Said Newt. Nice as in exact or precise, said Anathema, in the weary tones of one who'd explained this before. That's what it used to mean. But look, said Newt. He'd nearly convinced himself about the non-existence of the UFO, which was clearly a figment of his imagination, and the Tibetan could have been a... Well, he was working on it, but whatever it wasn't a Tibetan. But what he was more and more convinced of was that he was in a room with a very attractive woman, who appeared actually to like him, or at least not to dislike him, which was a definite first for Newt. And admittedly, there seemed to be a lot of strange stuff going on, but if he really tried poling the boat of common sense upstream against the raging current of the evidence, he could pretend it was all, well, weather balloons, or Venus, or mass hallucination. In short, whatever Newt was now thinking with, it wasn't his brain. But look, he said, the world isn't really going to end now, is it? I mean, just look around. It's not like there's any international tension. Well, any more than there normally is. Why don't we leave this stuff for a while and just go and, I don't know, maybe we could just go for a walk somewhere or something? I mean, don't you understand? There's something here. Something that affects the area, she said. It's twisted all the ley lines. It's protecting the area against anything that might change it. It's... There it was again. The thought in her mind that she could not, was not allowed to grasp, like a dream upon waking. The windows rattled. Outside, a sprig of jasmine, driven by the wind, started to bang insistently on the glass. But I can't get a fix on it, said Anathema, twisting her fingers together. I've tried everything. Fix? Said Newt. I've tried the pendulum, I've tried the theodolite. I'm psychic, you see, but it seems to move around. Newt was still in control of his own mind enough to do the proper translation. What most people said, when they said, I'm psychic, you see, they meant, I have an overactive but unoriginal imagination, wear black nail varnish, and talk to my budgie. When Anathema said it, it sounded as though she was admitting to a hereditary disease which she'd much prefer not to have. Armageddon moves around, said Newt. Various prophecies say the Antichrist has to arise first, said Anathema. Agnes says he. I can't spot him. Or her, said Newt. What? Could be a her, said Newt. This is the 20th century, after all. Equal opportunities. I don't think you're taking this entirely seriously, she said severely. Anyway, there isn't any evil here. That's what I don't understand. There's just love. Sorry? Said Newt. She gave him a helpless look. It's hard to describe it, she said. Something or someone loves this place. Loves every inch of it so powerfully that it shields and protects it. A deep down, huge, fierce love. How can anything bad start here? How can the end of the world start in a place like this? This is the kind of town you'd want to raise your kids in. It's a kid's paradise. She smiled weakly. You should see the local kids. They're unreal. Right out of the boys' own paper, all scabby knees and brilliant and bullseyes. She nearly had it. She could feel the shape of the thought. She was gaining on it. What's this place? Said Newt. What? Anathema screamed as her train of thought was derailed. Newt's finger tapped at the map. Disused aerodrome, it says. Just here, look, west of Tadfield itself. Anathema snorted. Disused? Don't you believe it? Used to be a wartime fighter base. It's been up at Tadfield Air Base for about 10 years or so. And before you say it, the answer's no. I hate everything about that bloody place, but the Colonel's saner than you are by a long way. His wife does yoga, for God's sake. Now, what was it she'd said before? The kids round here? She felt her mental feet slipping away from under her, and she fell back into the more personal thought waiting there to catch her. Newt was okay, really. And the thing about spending the rest of your life with him was he wouldn't be around long enough to get on your nerves. The radio was talking about South American rainforests. New ones. It began to hail. Bullets of ice shredded the leaves around them as Adam led them down into the quarry. Dog slunk along with his tail between his legs, whining. This wasn't right, he was thinking. Just when I was getting the hang of rats, just when I'd nearly sorted out that bloody German shepherd across the street. Now he's going to end it all, and I'll be back with the old glowing eyes and chasing lost souls. What's the sense in that? They don't fight back, and there's no taste to 'em. Wensleydale, Brian, and Pepper were not thinking quite so coherently. All that they were aware of was that they could no more not follow Adam than fly. Try to resist the force marching them forward would simply result in multiplying broken legs, and they'd still have to march. Adam wasn't thinking at all. Something had opened in his mind and was aflame. He set them down on the crate. We'll all be all right down here, he said. Said Wensleydale. Don't you think our mothers and fathers... Don't you worry about them, said Adam loftily. I can make some new ones. There won't be any of this being in bed by 9:30 either. You don't ever have to go to bed, ever, if you don't want to, or tidy your room or anything. You just leave it all to me and it'll be great. He gave them a manic smile. I've got some new friends coming, he confided. You'll like 'em. But, Wensleydale began. You just think of all the amazing stuff afterwards, said Adam enthusiastically. You can fill up America with all new cowboys and Indians and policemen and gangsters and cartoons and spacemen and stuff. Wouldn't it be fantastic? Wensleydale looked miserably at the other two. They were sharing a thought that none of them would be able to articulate very satisfactorily, even in normal times. Broadly, it was that there had once been real cowboys and gangsters, and that was great. And there would always be pretend cowboys and gangsters, and that was also great. But real, pretend cowboys and gangsters that were alive and not alive and could be put back in their box when you were tired of them, this did not seem great at all. The whole point about gangsters and cowboys and aliens and pirates was that you could stop being them and go home. But before all that, said Adam darkly, we're really going to show 'em. There was a tree in the plaza. It wasn't very big, and the leaves were yellow, and the light it got through the excitingly dramatic smoked glass was the wrong sort of light. And it was on more drugs than an Olympic athlete, and loudspeakers nested in the branches. But it was a tree, and if you half closed your eyes and looked at it over the artificial waterfall, you could almost believe that you were looking at a sick tree through a fog of tears. Jaime Ernez liked to have his lunch under it. The maintenance supervisor would shout at him if he found out, but Jaime had grown up on a farm, and it had been quite a good farm, and he had liked trees, and he didn't want to have to come into the city, but what could you do? It wasn't a bad job, and the money was the kind of money his father hadn't dreamed of. His grandfather hadn't dreamed of any money at all. He hadn't even known what money was until he was 15. But there were times when you needed trees, and the shame of it, Jamie thought, was that his children were growing up thinking of trees as firewood, and his grandchildren would think of trees as history. But what could you do? Where there were trees now, there were big farms. Where there were small farms now, there were plazas. And where there were plazas, there were still plazas, and that's how it went. He hid his trolley behind the newspaper stand and sat down furtively and opened his lunchbox. It was then that he became aware of the rustling and a movement of shadows across the floor. He looked around. The tree was moving. He watched it with interest. Jaime had never seen a tree growing before. The soil, which was nothing more than a scree of some sort of artificial chippings, was actually crawling as the roots moved around under the surface. Jaime saw a thin white shoot creep down the side of the raised garden area and prod blindly at the concrete of the floor. Without knowing why, without ever knowing why, he nudged it gently with his foot until it was close to a crack between the slabs. It found it and bored down. The branches were twisting into different shapes. Jaime heard the screech of traffic outside the building, but didn't pay it any attention. Someone was yelling something, but someone was always yelling in Jaime's vicinity, often at him. The questing root must have found the buried soil. It changed color and thickened, like a fire hose when the water is turned on. The artificial waterfall stopped running. Jaime visualized fractured pipes blocked with sucking vapors. Now he could see what was happening outside. The street surface was heaving like a sea. Saplings were pushing up between the cracks. Of course, he reasoned. They had sunlight. His tree didn't. All it had was the muted gray light that came through the dome 4 stories up. Dead light. But what could you do? You could do this. The elevators had stopped running because the power was off, but it was only 4 flights of stairs. Jaime carefully shut his lunchbox and padded back to his cart, where he selected his longest broom. People were pouring out of the building, yelling. Jaime moved amiably against the flow like a salmon going upstream. A white framework of girders, where the architect had presumably thought made a dynamic statement about something or other, held up the smoked glass dome. In fact, it was some sort of plastic, and it took Jaime, perched on a convenient strip of girder, all his strength and the full leverage of the broom's length to crack it. A couple more swings brought it down in lethal shards. The light poured in, lighting up the dust in the plaza so the air looked as though it was full of fireflies. Far below, the tree burst the walls of its brushed concrete prison and rose like an express train. Jaime had never realized that trees made a sound when they grew, and no one else had realized it either, because the sound is made over hundreds of years in waves 24 hours from peak to peak. Speed it up, and the sound a tree makes is vroom. Jamie watched it. It came toward him like a green mushroom cloud. Steam was billowing out from around its roots. The girders never stood a chance. The remnant of the dome went up like a ping-pong ball on a water spray. It was the same all over the city, except that you couldn't see the city anymore. All you could see was the canopy of green. It stretched from horizon to horizon. Jaime sat on his branch, clung to a liana, and laughed and laughed and laughed. Presently, it began to rain. The Kapamaki, a whaling research vessel, was currently researching the question, how many whales can you catch in 1 week? Except that today, there weren't any whales. The crew stared at the screens, which by the application of ingenious technology, could spot anything larger than a sardine and calculate its net value on the international oil market, and found them blank. The occasional fish that did show up was barreling through the water as if in a great hurry to get elsewhere. The captain drummed his fingers on the console. He was afraid that he might soon be conducting his own research project to find out what happened to a statistically small sample of whaler captains who came back without a factory ship full of research material. He wondered what they did to you. Maybe they locked you in a room with a harpoon gun and expected you to do the honorable thing. This was unreal. There ought to be something. The navigator punched up a chart and stared at it. "Honorable sir," he said. "What is it?" said the captain testily. "We seem to have a miserable instrument failure. Seabed in this area should be 200 meters. "What of it?" "I'm reading 15,000 meters, honorable sir, and still falling." "That is foolish. There is no such depth." The captain glared at several million yen worth of cutting-edge technology and thumped it. The navigator gave a nervous smile. Sir, it is shallower already." Beneath the thunders of the upper deep, as Aziraphale and Tennyson both knew, far, far beneath in the abyssal sea, the Kraken sleepeth. And now, it was waking up. Millions of tons of deep ocean ooze cascade off its flanks as it rises. "See?" said the navigator. 3,000 meters already! The Kraken doesn't have eyes. There's never been anything for it to look at. But as it billows up through the icy waters, it picks up the microwave noise of the sea, the sorrowing beeps and whistles of the whale song. Said the navigator. 1,000 meters? The Kraken is not amused. 500 meters? The factory ship rocks on the sudden swell. 100 meters! There is a tiny metal thing above it. The Kraken stirs, and 10 billion sushi dinners cry out for vengeance. The cottage windows burst inward. This wasn't a storm, it was war. Fragments of jasmine whirled across the room, mingled with the rain of file cards. Newt and Anathema clung to one another in the space between the overturned table and the wall. "Go on," muttered Newt. "Tell me how Agnes predicted this." "She did say he bringeth the storm," said Anathema. "This is a bloody hurricane. Did she say what's supposed to happen next?" 2315 is cross-referenced to 3477, said Anathema. "You can remember details like that at a time like this." "Since you mention it, yes," she said, and held out a card. 3477. "Let the wheel of fate turn, let hearts enjoin. There are other fires than mine. When the wind bloweth the blossoms, reach out one to another. For the calm cometh when red and white and black and pale approach. To peace is our profession." Some mysticism here, one fears. A.F. Device, October 17th, 1889. Peas blossoms? OFD, 1929, September 4th. Revelations, chapter 6 again, I presume. Dr. Thoth's Device, 1835. Newt read it again. There was a sound outside, like a sheet of corrugated iron pinwheeling across the garden, which was exactly what it was. "Is this supposed to mean," he said slowly, "that we're supposed to become an item? That Agnes, what a joker." Courting is always difficult when the one being courted has an elderly female relative in the house. They tend to mutter, or cackle, or bum cigarettes, or, in the worst cases, get out the family photograph album, an act of aggression in the sex war which ought to be banned by a Geneva Convention. It's much worse when the relative has been dead for 300 years. Newt had indeed been harboring certain thoughts about Anathema. Not just harboring them, in fact, but dry-docking them, refitting them, giving them a good coat of paint, and scraping the barnacles off their bottom. But the idea of Agnes's second sight boring into the back of his neck sloshed over his libido like a bucketful of cold water. He had even been entertaining the idea of inviting her out for a meal, but he hated the idea of some Cromwellian witch sitting in her cottage 3 centuries earlier and watching him eat. He was in the mood in which people burned witches. His life was quite complicated enough without it being manipulated across the centuries by some crazed old woman. A thump in the grate sounded like part of the chimney stack coming down. And then he thought, "My life isn't complicated at all. I can see it as clearly as Agnes might. It stretches all the way to early retirement, a whip round from the people in the office, a bright little neat flat somewhere, a neat little empty death. Except now I'm going to die under the ruins of a cottage during what might possibly be the end of the world. The recording angel won't have any trouble with me. My life must have been dittos on every page for years. I mean, what have I ever really done? I've never robbed a bank. I've never had a parking ticket. I've never eaten Thai food." Somewhere, another window caved in, with a merry tinkle of breaking glass. Anathema put her arms around him with a sigh which really didn't sound disappointed at all. "I've never been to America, or France, because Calais doesn't really count. I've never learned to play a musical instrument." The radio died as the power lines finally gave up. He buried his face in her hair. "I've never..." There was a pinging sound. Shadwell, who had been bringing the army paybooks up to date, looked up in the middle for signing for Witchfinder Lance Corporal Smith. It took him a while to notice that the gleam of Newt's pin was no longer on the map. He got down from his stool, muttering under his breath, and searched around on the floor until he found it. He gave it another polish and put it back in Tadfield. He was just signing for Witchfinder Private Table, who got an extra 2d a year hay allowance, where there was another ping. He retrieved the pin, glared at it suspiciously, and pushed it so hard into the map that the plaster behind it gave way. Then he went back to the ledgers. There was a ping. This time the pin was several feet from the wall. Shadwell picked it up, examined its point, pushed it into the map, and watched it. After about 5 seconds, it shot past his ear. He scrabbled for it on the floor, replaced it on the map, and held it there. It moved under his hand. He leaned his weight on it. A tiny thread of smoke curled out of the map. Shadwell gave a whimper and sucked his fingers as the red-hot pin ricocheted off the opposite wall and smashed a window. It didn't want to be in Tadfield. 10 seconds later, Shadwell was rummaging through the WA's cash box, which yielded a handful of copper, a 10-shilling note, and a small counterfeit coin from the reign of James I. Regardless of personal safety, he rummaged in his own pockets. The results of the trawl, even with his pensioner's concessionary travel pass taken into consideration, were barely enough to get him out of the house, let alone to Tadfield. The only other people he knew who had money were Mr. Rajit and Madame Tracy. As far as the Rajits were concerned, the question of 7 weeks' rent would probably crop up in any financial discussion he instigated at this point, and as for Madame Tracy, who'd only be willing to lend him a handful of used tenors... "I'll be swagging if I'll take the wages of sin for the painted Jezebel," he said, which left no one else, save one, the Southern Pansy. They'd each been here, just once, spending as little time as possible in the room, and in Aziraphale's case, trying not to touch any flat surface. The other one, the flash Southern bastard in the sunglasses, was, Shadwell suspected, not someone he ought to offend. In Shadwell's simple world, anyone in sunglasses who wasn't actually on a beach was probably a criminal. He suspected that Crowley was from the Mafia, or the underworld, although he would have been surprised how right he nearly was. But the soft one in the camel hair coat was a different matter, and he'd risked trailing him back to his base once, and he could remember the way. He thought Aziraphale was a Russian spy. He could ask him for money, threaten him a bit. It was terribly risky. Shadwell pulled himself together. Even now, young Newt might be suffering unimaginable tortures at the hands of the Daughters of Night, and he, Shadwell, had sent him. "We cannot leave our people in there," he said, and put on his thin overcoat and shapeless hat, and went out into the street. The weather seemed to be blowing up a bit. And that's where we're going to end it for today. So, I will be back tomorrow with our next section, and we'll be back to Aziraphale and Crowley next time. So, I hope that everybody has a great afternoon. Stay safe, stay healthy. I'll be back tomorrow with more. Bye, everyone. See you then.